little bit of context for those of you who weren't on the webinar earlier today. Commonweal was hosting a series of Commonweal conversations with the focus on reimagining the U.S. Church. And so this was the fourth of four in a series where we really focused on community and sacramental life. Some of the previous ones included talking about Catholic institutions, women in the church, and Catholic education. And so really our hope from the conversation, at least from the panelist perspective, was just to shine a light on how this current moment that we are all present and experiencing in has helped us to rethink what parish life is and what it can look like moving forward. We looked at some of the challenges and some of the opportunities there. And I felt really blessed and really encouraged by the conversation. We definitely hit on some difficult and challenging topics, but there was also a lot of hope that came from it as well. So my hope is to let the rest of the panelists speak for themselves, but then I'll jump in as we get into more of our conversation dialogue piece to let this be more of a in-depth and open conversation. I wanted to start with just a quick prayer to help us get going. I introduced the idea of the theme of prophetic dialogue, and I wanted to start actually with a prayer that we've been using in my work along the opportunity to engage young people and people who are invested in the lives of young people in the church in conversation. This process that was called the National Dialogue. For those of you not familiar with it, it was a years-long process of consultation and discussion and bringing things together, but it was really based on this idea of dialogue. And so as we enter into our dialogue this evening, both with the video from our panel today and then the conversation we'll have tonight, I'll start off with this short, but I think poignant prayer. So we'll begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Loving God, open us to the beauty of dialogue that allows us to hear with our hearts and speak with our souls. May our conversations ignite your spirit within us to go out into the world as missionary disciples. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, so Gabriella, I'm going to let you go ahead and share your screen. And I know we highlighted some of the key pieces that we thought would be most relevant. So we'll start with this first question about what has been revealed to us during this time. And I think this is about a little bit more than 10, 12-minute clip. So we'll let this run, and feel free to add your questions in the chat, just so that when we get back to our discussion piece, those will still be fresh. And that way we can all kind of start thinking about what we want to share and respond to as we go. Ariel, take it away.
All right. Life and even our sacramental life. I'll open it up to whoever would like to share first, and then the rest of you may respond.
Well, I can jump in first. Two observations that I've really seen in the life of my own parish have been, one, how fragile parish life really is. When this first started, we were really challenged in my local community here in Chicago with the reality that my pastor had gone out of the country to visit his family in Kenya, and he was not allowed to come back into the United States until August. He's the only priest in our parish, and so our deacon, who is well into his 70s, had to step in so many ways to help lead the parish spiritually, but we also had a gap of leadership. And it really showed some of the flaws that we have in our parish structures and organization, where there wasn't a clear sense of who was going to step into that role of leading and making decisions and really guiding parish life. The second thing, it really showed that there's a fundamental flaw in some of our parishes where we have a hard time being church outside of church, or being church outside of our four walls. And I think what this really called many communities to have to look into is, how can we be creative in reaching our parishioners and reaching our local community? And how can we think more broadly about the social needs that our communities are being called to serve. The reality is, one of our ministries is a food pantry. We were definitely serving well beyond our borders and our boundaries during this time of pandemic. And so many people were in need of food and support, but we were limited in our scope and what we can do and who we can offer it to. And so I think for me, fundamentally, the thing that I was challenged by was to really look at how our parishes are structured, who has leadership and who feels called to lead, especially when there is a crisis, when there is an emergency there, and that feeling of not always being adequate enough in our preparation to respond to those challenges and to those times of uncertainty.
Thank you, Darius.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on some of the things that Darius said, which are really just spot on, I think. For me, looking at this from in the Northeast, in the Bronx, it's been apocalyptic in that the virus has, or the quarantine, the effects of the virus have revealed a lot, right? There's been a peeling away of a lot of the fictions that we had about the resilience of our church, about shared governance, about what it means to be a community that we call a church. So I think of the things that it's revealed, it reveals that revenue streams are problematic for parishes without mass. That we need money, and the only way that we get money is through in-person worship, then that's going to be a really big problem moving forward. It's revealed to me also that a lot of ordained ministers are at a loss. They experience a kind of desolation when they don't have a sacramental ministry to do. But to go along with that, you get a lot of neglect of parishioners. So I have friends of mine, soccer mothers, that's the official name for soccer moms, the soccer mothers who are catechists who did not hear from their pastors. I haven't heard from them in 7 months. Not a phone call, not an "Are you all alive?" Nothing. So there's a real sort of lack of ministry outside of sacramental ministry. And the third thing that is revealed in this overlap with racial justice rallies and also with the election season is really the kind of horrifically bad conscience formation that is going on in many of our parishes, and whose voices are getting heard in that. So it reveals those things. It intensifies some of our tendencies, right? Our polarizing tendencies, because now we can shop for mass on a global mall, not just in a local, like what you can drive to, because we can go to any live stream. It also intensifies that border crossing that I think Darius was talking about, where parishes are working outside of their borders, but also individual Catholics are moving beyond their borders. One of our cousins found the priest from Venezuela that she liked when she lived in New York, and now she lives in Seattle, but she can still go to his mass. And she was actually really consoled by that. And then the last thing is, I think it's inviting us to new possibilities, right? And the new possibilities that I'm seeing are possibilities for the return of the parish as a hub of social service, which it has been in the United States in the past, right? As a place where people go for mental health, for AA, not just for sacramental ministry, but, why aren't we hosting learning hubs or, school pods and things like that in these buildings that could really sort of help people through difficult times? And also, the second possibility that I hope it brings up is possibilities for really shared governance. Because what Darius said is really true, right? If the pastor is gone or sick or in quarantine, and that leaves the entire parish in a lurch, then we really need a better model.
For me, this is an interesting question because as an adult, I've never been a parish Catholic. I've always, since I was 18, I've been a member of a Marianist lay community, and that has been my official church. So the shift for that we experienced starting in March and are still living out has made me feel like more of a central Catholic than I have in years. So this is really an interesting shift to think about some of the other places Catholicism lives outside of parishes, when so much focus has been both on parishes and on the hierarchical leadership that frames that parish model. So I think that's one thing to think about, is that like both Natalia and Darius said, it's important to think about what is the leadership and shared leadership or discipleship of equals that we may be called to, as well as where are the places that people have been practicing Catholicism in very different ways for thousands of years. And so I think we have models that have never stopped existing, but sometimes we set up our walls. And I'm so excited you said walls, Darius, because I have that in my notes. Like I have my little main points here. And this afternoon, I was just thinking, wow, it's so fascinating to think about. I'm from El Paso, so the wall is central, and I almost wore my walls t-shirt. But it's central to what I'm thinking all the time. But then thinking about the walls of our buildings and which buildings we have. So not just parish buildings, but also school buildings, institutions of higher ed, Catholic hospitals, Catholic charities. So those are the other pieces of not just how are we practicing Catholicism, but how is Catholicism infiltrating into society and forming society and social existence. So I looked up a couple of things, and Catholic hospitals serve at least 1 in 7 people in the USA every single day. And along with that goes everything that has to do with main Catholic teaching, for better and for worse. So there's all kinds of stuff on that, and that might be a whole other conversation to be had. But it's just interesting to me to think about that, Catholic charities, Catholic social services, all of the places that, and yes, Darius and Natalia are very right, parishes have opened up very broadly, but also what are the other places that have had to ramp up from Catholic backgrounds, Catholic perspectives, Catholic identity to attend to what is happening now?
Gosh, I feel I'm so impressed with my colleagues' comments here, and so I probably won't have too much to say, except that as a student of parish life, I've noticed over the last 20 years or so how the kind of theology of the new evangelization has had a very big impact in a lot of parishes. Focusing attention on liturgical participation and parish involvement is kind of the big markers of being a totally evangelized Catholic. And I think this has revealed the shortcomings of that. There might be many good things about that. And I think about how this also sometimes affects parish renewal programs that seem to focus their attention there. A lot of them, most of them, maybe all of them. and also the way it can kind of dovetail in a strange way with old notions that people have about if you don't attend Sunday Mass, that it's a mortal sin. And so my graduate students who are mostly pastoral ministers come and tell me about people that are absolutely lost without being able to come to Sunday Mass, or because they're afraid because of their particular sensitivities or vulnerabilities. And even people who are angry here in Los Angeles when the churches didn't open right away, and saw it in terms of their basic rights as Catholics were being violated. I think it really opened up all that, and it showed us that we're a bit compartmentalized, and my colleagues have been talking about this sometimes in our faith. And I think of what Naomi just said about some of the wonderful things that are happening in places other than parishes. But we really need in our parish life to be helping, kind of equipping people to be Catholics in their work and at home, and not to compartmentalize the faith so much. I wonder sometimes if a lot of us as Catholics, and maybe this afflicts us white Catholics more, but if we even know how to pray outside of liturgy.
Thank you. You're all raising such important points. I feel like we could have a whole other session just to talk about each of them. But I think I want to attempt to look at them a little further. In the past 4 weeks, this series has been titled Reimagining U.S. Catholicism Today. And it's invited us to reimagine how Catholic institutions have been transformed and to think about what needs to change in order to support the change. And you've all already began to allude to that, right? You've touched on our, the tradition of how even parishes handle their finances and what they're dependent on. How we are perhaps neglecting parishioners in this time due to the pandemic, and how that's been revealed, right? And even how we share leadership. And I'm really struck by some of the things that were said. You guys said that the parish, to imagine the parish as a hub of social service, and to me that was kind of a bomb that's been that maybe for some might explode in the middle of what they usually do, right? Like to think of the parish in those terms. So I'm wondering, what do you guys think? What kind of transformation is actually required? If you can kind of go a little deeper into that, even in regards to the leadership in our particular practices.
I think what Brett was saying about the new evangelization, making mass going as the sort of central pillar of good Catholicism, is a great place to start in terms of transformation. As Naomi said, there are thousands of Catholics in this country and throughout the Americas for whom mass going is virtually impossible because of lack of priests and rural location and lack of interest by the church in having sort of mass available to non-white Catholics. And so the idea that one's goodness as a Catholic, or one's Catholic sort of chops or props, I forget the word, but whatever, your Catholic credentials rest entirely on this Sunday obligation, really does cause people to have a lot of stress when the Sunday obligation is out of the question, right? So I wonder if we need a reappropriation of the word Eucharist, right? When Vatican II says that the Eucharist is the summit and the source of the Christian life, do they mean Mass? Or did they mean some sort of a sharing of life that is taking part in the way that God shared God's life with us? I think that we've made the Eucharist too small by locating it only in the Sunday Mass. And I wonder if a more expansive idea of what it means to be a Eucharistic church outside of the parish, outside of those walls that Naomi was talking about, I wonder if that more expansive view is a good place to start.
That's great, Natalia. And I really, one of the things that's been coming back to me during this time is the what is sometimes called in the Hebrew prophets, the anti-cultus, this kind of prophetic, direct, these prophetic comments directed at the people because they're spending so much of their energy and time on ritual observance and on worship, but neglecting their responsibilities to one another or to the poor or to the marginal, to the stranger. And I think, again, some of this is not our fault, right? It's the compartmentalization of our society that we break everything into little boxes, and religion is one of those boxes. But yeah, I think, to me, that was a great comfort to think about those texts calling us to let our Catholic faith suffuse all of our lives, to let the Eucharist be something, yes, that's important to us. It's important to me in terms of mass going, but also something that is in every part of my life, where I feel my creatureliness, my thanksgiving to God, the word Eucharist meaning thanksgiving, and I'm using that experience of love and mercy from God to share that love and mercy with everyone else, again, in work or in my family life or in my service of strangers, immigrants, and the poor.
Two things that really stand out to me has been in relationship to who is leading in many ways in parishes and who has had to step up during this time into key roles. And so being blessed to work with a lot of youth ministers, it's been actually really funny to see the number of youth ministers who have taken on additional responsibilities in these past 7 months. The most common being the person in charge of the live stream and tech and communications and social media. And all of these things that were once considered kind of secondary or extra have now become essential roles for parish life. But I think with that, we still have not treated those ministers, those individual leaders, as being essential players. In many dioceses, we've seen cuts and cutbacks. Many parishes have let go of some of those people who were kind of the ones who helped us get through the worst parts of this. And so I'm feeling particularly challenged to say, both from a practical but also a justice perspective, how do we create safe spaces for our lay ministry leaders to both be recognized for the gifts and tools that they bring to do this pastoral ministry work, but also how do we protect them so that they are not the first ones on the chopping block when we have to make these really difficult decisions around finances. And more so than ever, I think we really need to lean on the creativity and gifts of young people during this moment, because they know how to meet our communities where they're at. They're living and swimming and breathing in these worlds that many of our traditional pastoral ministers are not comfortable with yet, particularly clergy, or are just not equipped to figure out how to use those most effectively. And so I think that's a huge piece. The other thing too is I think we have to recognize that if we have not engaged our communities during this time, there is a huge lack of trust. There is a lack of sense of connection and belonging. And in many different ways, the church has struggled with trust issues over the years. But I think in this process of kind of reinventing parishes or reimagining what parishes can be or should be, none of that matters if your community doesn't trust you. And so I think part of what we have to do is invest in really rebuilding goodwill and relationships with those who felt alone or ignored or left out during this time because they weren't able to get that phone call from their pastor or get that check-in from somebody from the parish office, or even access the liturgy or resources that we provide because we weren't able or creative enough to do that.
I want to return back to Natalia's point about Eucharist as being only going to Mass. And sometimes I think not just our practices, but our actual theology can be negative. Like it can have some negative consequences. And I've had messages multiple times over these months of people writing to me and saying, can you provide me some resources to give to my parents or to so-and-so because they don't believe me that it's okay to stay home and stay away. And this just happened this weekend to me for multiple people because El Paso now has the highest rate of positive numbers in the country of a city over 400,000. And so people were writing to me and saying, can you send me those resources? I know you've sent them in the past. Or do you think that the diocese is going to make some sort of public statement again saying we don't need to be in Mass, even if all of the special protocols are happening? But when we're talking about life and death and pro-life issues, this is a pro-life issue. To be able to do other things and still claim our Catholic identity and not have the gravity of a mortal sin put upon us because we cannot participate physically in Eucharistic celebrations, I think is really important. So it's really important to rethink those and to share that information that it's not the absolute worst thing to do during this time to stay home, and that these issues are also pro-life issues.
That's really lovely, Naomi. I think that also kind of that our parishes can be and have been in many places have been so. I mean, parish life as always is uneven, and but in some places, there are multiple volunteers and people involved in the parish who are checking on every person in the parish. There are places where where all kinds of activities are appearing online, and for people to participate in, and I think that that's the way that our parishes can be hubs, places where people can get even to volunteering. The other night at one parish, people asked, well, so I really want to do service, but my health doesn't permit me going outside. What can I do? I was like, you know what? My sister-in-law is tutoring online. I mean, there's actually lots of opportunities, and our parishes can be kind of hubs because they're, at least in the places where there are trusted. I'm aware of what Darius said about trust. then people think, okay, I can go with what they're recommending. So, and Darius, I also feel what you said about not just the gap between clergy and lay people sometimes in providing, innovative ways to do church, but sometimes the generational gap. I think of my own kind of discomfort sometimes with social media, whereas, somebody who's 20 years younger than me can just, intuitively knows what's going on and can help people connect through it. And I'm like, oh.
I still don't understand Twitter, Brett, but I get on there, I throw stuff out, I'm like, it happens. But I also, and I'm super bad at this, absolutely terrible, but I think we need to start envisioning other possibilities that don't include the internet, because as to how we're doing, so going back to Natalia's point about parishes being the hub of social services, but also how do we do things and have people experience sacramental life that doesn't necessarily include the internet, because not everybody has access, and not just that people aren't comfortable, but not everybody has access to a computer or Wi-Fi in their house, or the best Wi-Fi in their house. So I think those pieces are all important to think about. Again, I'm the worst.
I think we're entering into a really interesting moment where this is all going to be compounded as we get closer to the holidays. And those experiences tend to circle around specific liturgical celebrations, but also communal celebrations of family and relatives and friends. And in many places in the country, we are not going to be able to gather in that same way. And so if parishes haven't started making that turn to think very creatively about how they're going to be able to celebrate in a time when it's very difficult to feel like celebrating anything, let alone to gather and be together, we're going to end up spending some really, really hard holidays separated from one another. And it can't just be, by virtual internet. There are some places around the country, weather permitting, where they're finding open spaces and just gathering, in small groups and doing faith sharing. People are trying to figure out, particularly with some of the young adult groups I know, how to do caroling, and how do you do where you spread everybody out, 10 feet from each other, but can still go and bring some of that Christmas cheer. We're going to have to start planning for that creativity now, because we're less than a month away from Thanksgiving. Christmas is there, and everything in between, Guadalupe, Immaculate Conception, all of these things that we've just taken for granted suddenly are off the table, and we have to reimagine them in very different ways.
The other thing, I'm sorry, Claudia, one little thing that I want to throw in here is I like to throw these theology bombs and then see what happens. But hasn't this whole virtual being church on little screens and little boxes, the way I'm seeing you guys and people are seeing us right now, hasn't that just awakened in us a new appreciation of incarnation, right? And what it means to be incarnate. Like, I hate teaching online because I need my students physically present. I need to share a room with them. And as we approach the holidays, what Darius is saying, so much of what makes the holidays special is that sharing of material life that you don't get through a screen. So we are going to have to be really creative, right? One thing that popped into my head just as you were talking is like, why don't we do more serenatas, where we like, for old people who are by themselves at Thanksgiving, if you could drop a meal off, or if you could like get a parish going, a sign up or whatever, where you could drop off a meal and sing a song from a window or something to wave so that they feel like they're part of a community. I think we're going to need to rediscover these popular religious practices and sort of re-engage them as ways to build incarnational community when we cannot have proximity.
I think I want.
Is that a good place to stop, Darius?
Yeah, no, I think so. So I know there was a lot there, and so I appreciate those who were putting things in the chat, and just wanted to give people an opportunity to respond or share their thoughts on what they've heard so far, what stood out to you, what surprised you or challenged you from that conversation. Again, being part of it, I thoroughly enjoyed the back and forth that was happening and what people were responding to from one another. But I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts specifically on kind of what has been revealed during this time about parish life.
Yeah, I work in a parish. Uh, yeah, and it has been tough. And I'm gonna be very straightforward in that St. Teresa of Avila is rather lucky in that we are situated in the highest income zip code in the city of Chicago, and our donations have been relatively steady. It's gone down here and there, but compared to other parishes, we have been lucky. But when we're talking about doing church in COVID, I've discovered how, and this is definitely coming from the privilege of where I'm sitting at St. Teresa, how amazing digital Zoom conversations can be. I'm actually pro Zoom a little bit when it comes to ministry, which puts me in the minority of Christians, right? In the sense that I guess I don't like it because I can't, like, you can't really do like the emotional reading of people in a room, which is like challenging for emotional spirituality talk, right? But I found that kind of the collapsing of walls and geographic barriers has actually been beneficial. In July, St. Teresa headed out a discussion of Brian Massagale's Racial Justice of the Catholic Church that brought together over, I think it was like 50 people from around the country. And then we're running Alpha in the fall, and we have people from all around the diocese. That's more local, but more. And then Darius is taking part in this. We're doing discussions of the Jesuits' new civic engagement guide. And with that, we're coordinating with seven other parishes, including parishes from the western suburbs, northern suburbs, the city. And that could never have happened before COVID. Like, I feel like getting people from Wilmette and Riverside and Lincoln Park and Rogers Park and the South Side together for 3 weeks straight would have been a little bit challenging. Yes, Darius, you are welcome to join. Everyone is welcome to join. Everyone should join. We have 8 different times available. Now I'm just advertising, but everyone should join. But like I said, I guess the point of what I'm saying is, from my perch of being a 23-year-old tech-savvy pastoral minister, I have found that it's a small benefit in being able to collapse parish boundaries in some level.
Yeah, and I would add to it too, your point around accessibility, I think, is really important. I know at a more larger national scale, it's something that we've talked about a lot, that anybody who used to host conferences or events, those events, even if they move them around the country to make them more accessible, would still be really expensive to go to, especially when you add travel and housing and all that. And so now that everybody's had to move some of these opportunities virtually, it suddenly opens up doors for people who normally couldn't participate to join. But I don't want to lose Naomi's point, which was, though it is definitely something that many people have access and ability to participate in, there are lots of people who don't have good internet access or are in very remote parts of the country, and that isn't an option for them. And I think that's really where the personal outreach and intention of pastoral ministers is so important. I mentioned for myself, I had such a great appreciation for our parish secretary, because she wasn't going to the office, but she took the list of all of the parishioners, whatever contact information we had, and she would just make phone calls for 2-3 hours a day just to do wellness checks on people, check in with some of our older parishioners. She was connecting parishioners to each other and saying like, hey, so-and-so, could you mind going shopping for this woman because she's older and can't go on her own, and she really needs some help. I mean, so things like that, I think, show some of the creativity and the intentionality of parish ministers. I just know not every parish is equipped, or not everybody felt empowered to do that. And I think that's definitely one of the big challenges we're still seeing playing out today.
Yeah, we did the phone call, and I definitely learned that I'm not. That phone calls make me very uncomfortable. But we got through like 1,000, 2,000 people who have ever been on our list, and we called people who were like, "Oh, I moved away 5 years ago," but that was a great phone call to get. So.
Yeah, I think to that point, I mean, sort of similar, but on a flip side, my mom is a teacher in Chicago public schools, and so when COVID started in the spring, she teaches preschool, so they weren't really equipped to get a bunch of 3 and 4-year-olds on Chromebooks and try to teach them anything. It was extremely challenging, right? So a lot of what she was doing was making phone calls to parents and checking in. Is there anything you need? You know, if you don't have internet, do you know you can come to the school and we have printouts of everything for you, right? And it, in some ways, it brought people closer together than when they had been in person for all of this time. And I've been wondering, sort of, for people who are more connected on the parish side, how it's like the pandemic has brought out our it feels like people are rising to the occasion, right? Of, I want to help my community. I want to help my elderly neighbor. I want to make sure, you know, such and such person has groceries. It feels like we're appealing to our better angels, and that makes me really hopeful in a lot of ways. And that says a lot because you guys know I'm very cynical. But it's almost like this is proving the point that so much of how the structure has been for years, it's just because it's what people are used to, has been irrelevant, because I don't know that people would have been getting the support before, right? A year ago, there were hungry people. A year ago, there were people who needed help getting groceries and going to the doctor and doing all of the things they need to do now. Was anybody talking to them about it? I don't think so.
Thinking about the like the relevance or irrelevance of the ways we've been doing things, I think I've been most struck kind of from this conversation with something I think that you brought up, Darius, which is like the inversion that's kind of happened that has been so revelatory of like all of our weaknesses, that the things that were happening kind of on the side or as like a side project and everything is now maybe one of the only ways or some of the only people who know how to keep us all together at this one point. But in terms of how that's also been a weakness for us, I feel like I've seen, I had the opportunity to be back in the parish I grew up in this summer. And even though they had been offering some live stream options all along, you could just tell like that their own weaknesses to value that kind of work and to value their music ministers and their catechists and stuff like that, all of a sudden meant that all of it disappeared literally over a summer, because all of the kind of budget constraints and kind of those compounding weaknesses just meant that like we can't even sustain what we're doing, which was really sad to see. And I think it kind of speaks to that point of like that it does come down to a formation of relationships. It does come to a position of justice and how we treat people in our parish. So it's definitely encouraged us to speak to our better angels, but I think it's also there's been a real stripping away of some communities as a result.
Yeah, man, you said there's just so much here that's so great. Darius, I wanted to follow back on what you said about specifically in the Chicago context. Before the pandemic, Catholic Chicago, not the newspaper, but the Catholic Chicago in general was a catastrophe because of Darius. I know I can tell you're laughing at that, because of the Renew My Church process, where I think on my side of it, I kind of and our parishes have gone through it already. So like I've gone through the culling, so I'm pretty like I'm sitting on the other side, and I think I'm a little bit more aware of the missionary disciple language and what that can look like. But for a lot of people, Renew My Church is a code word for corporate consolidation, and so there's kind of already. I was talking to my aunt, who goes to a church on the northwest side that's in danger of closing probably. And literally, even in the pandemic, the only thing she could talk about with Catholic context is how they're going to close her church. So there's already in the Chicago context, it's and now this is it's truncating, the arch is truncating the process over like a next year or so. So it's going to be even uglier. And I connected to this. A lot of churches, it's just interesting to hear how different challenges. Like we had one church that had challenges because they're kind of an older ornate church, and they get all their revenue from weddings, right? Who want to get married in that church. And so for at least that first 5 months, it was like red alert. So, oh man, there's so much we can talk about. It's so exciting. Darius, you brought that up. You have any thoughts about Renew My Church in the pandemic? Oh man, I'm really throwing at. Sorry, I'm the guest.
No.
So many thoughts.
Yes, no, too many thoughts in some ways. So for those who don't know, I worked at the diocese for many years before starting in my current gig a couple of years ago, and so I was at the diocesan offices when Renew My Church got started, and I think one of the things I was really mindful of is just the reputation that people have for downtown or the diocesan offices, and there isn't a lot of trust that's there. And I think part of it, and I think it was actually an article from Commonweal that came out in the last couple of weeks, this idea that the leadership or the hierarchy of the church has really gotten far away from the realities of common everyday parishioners. I think in Chicago in particular, I would say what we would sort of say our common demographic is those blue collar, city workers, union workers. Like we've really have taken a step back in seeing those individuals as part of, or really the prototype of who we minister to in our parishes. And in many ways, when you hear leadership talk, it sounds very much like they're catering to the elite, to the big donors, to the haves, which leaves a lot of people who are in that kind of middle class or lower middle class feeling very left out of conversations. And, when I worked at the regional level, I had parishes who were both considered really poor and really rich. Like same, Teresa was one of the parishes I worked with in Lincoln Park. I also had, parishes on some of the poorer parts of the north side, the rougher parts of Evanston, which are still actually pretty nice compared to some other places. But I also grew up in Humboldt Park, which was, the murder capital of the world, of the U.S. for a few years back in the 90s. And the disparity was really great. And it really felt like we were talking about two different realities of the Catholic Church in Chicago. And so there's a lot of that that's still there. And I think that becomes part of what we need to be addressing. It's not, for me, actually, Renew My Church, it's not that the process is bad. It's the steps you've taken along the way that have alienated people because you've done the process poorly. You haven't communicated well. You haven't been honest with people before. So they already come in with, these very poor expectations. And then they nitpick every piece because they're already coming in suspicious or skeptical. And I think that is something that we've not done a good job in some of our communities and parishes, ingratiating ourselves to our parishioners when we haven't taken care of those basic needs, those basic essentials that they're looking for. And it's not just, feed the hungry and the sick and the poor, it's the spiritual as well. Like we haven't taken care of their spiritual needs either.
I'm pretty sure you worked in Vicaria too when I was coming up in Vicaria too, now that I think about it.
So yeah, I worked at the Vicariate office for 6 years as the youth ministry coordinator. So
yeah, I grew up in St. John Brebeuf, so.
Oh, nice. I'm pretty sure I know your youth minister, Pam Perez.
Yeah, there we go. Man, small world. Not
Super
that small
world.
Catholic Chicago is not that small.
It's not that small.
It's not that big, I mean, yeah. Yeah, man, you said, echoing everything you said.
The model in Chicago is, 100 years old?
Mm-hmm.
The way parishes were mapped.
Yep.
They could have benefited from learning from our political parties and gerrymandering parishes a little bit better. over the last 100 years.
Well, and I think to that end, the structures that we've had in Chicago up until recently, we're still working off of an old model of, nationalistic, immigrant communities. What drove parishes to be built and what drove parishes to stay around. But then I think the church's lack of engagement in social and political life stopped them from really being attentive to those trends. One of them being gentrification. This was one of the biggest struggles that I saw, especially in the south side of Chicago and in parts of the northwest side. Those parishes had pastors who were a long time very much engaged in community organizations, community organizing efforts, dealing with issues around affordable housing. And when the church stopped being as engaged in those issues, the demographics of neighborhoods changed, but parishes didn't. The way we approached it, the way we organized it. And so we talked a little bit about Renew My Church. Our parish is going through that process just starting this past month. And one of the realities that I knew of, people seem really surprised in, is that out of the 3 parishes in our group, none of our parishes, the majority of people who go to the parish live in the neighborhood anymore. All of them were connected to the parish through families, through generations, but most have had to move out of the neighborhood. And so they're commuting to get to church. And so when you think about the drop off from ministry programming during the week, religious education courses or formation courses, they're not coming because they don't live in the neighborhood. And they weren't coming before COVID. Like, what do we think is going to happen right now when there are more than a fair number of excuses to come back? And so, Mark, to your point, I think that's where the virtual option becomes really helpful and important for those communities who are already spread out. This is a space where you can actually bring people together.
Yeah, two things came to my mind when you said that. One, we have the same issue at St. Teresa, where Lincoln Park in the 70s and 80s into the 90s was a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood, and then it was gentrified, and now it's Lincoln Park with your boutiques everywhere and whatnot. I sound like a cranky old man, but we still had a few parishioners coming from who knows where. I don't really know who are from that generation. They're older. And we unfortunately, when I got to St. Teresa, we unfortunately canceled or ended the Spanish language mass because we couldn't in our good conscience keep taking Spanish speaking priests to come do a mass for 10 people in Lincoln Park, right? And so one, I just wanted to echo that. I think these kind of legacy parishes that used to be a different St. Teresa used to like before in like the 50s and 40s and 30s used to be a German speaking parish. And so I could imagine in the 60s and 70s, there was a transition period from a German to Spanish speaking. And then a second, something else that you said that struck something with me is, and I think I'm just figuring out this at St. Teresa, is kind of having that digital presence that we can reach people who are not in Lincoln Park, right? Like the only language I have for this is like evil technocratic marketing language, but like we can essentially be a product. I don't like that word, but that's the only word I have, that could reach people all over the country if we really worked hard on it. And there's questions of how to remain sacramental, and how do you get people to tune into your mass if all mass are quote unquote the same, right? But there's just a lot of this like new, I'm like kind of excited about this new digital age of ministry, because I'm like discovering how like getting 60 people together every few months to discuss something has been really life-giving on my end as a pastoral minister. And it's because of what I'm good at. I'm not super good at like coordinating learning pods like the person said in the video, right? That's not my forte, but I'm sure that there's other things we could be doing in pandemic times that could be great.
I think this kind of popped up in a couple of spots, but I'm not sure how we move forward with this. And everything is that there seems to be real damage that requires repairing or reimagining some of the governance or like kind of the relationship between the clergy, the clerical structure of the church, and the laity and lay leadership. And I guess I'm not sure how we kind of proceed with that, because it's kind of Darius brought up, there's like a lack of trust that seems to be there. And as one of those things that kind of all has fallen on its head, like we talk about co-governorship, governorship, and it doesn't actually exist when a pandemic hits and your pastor is actually in charge of the situation. Or one of my colleagues who's in a parish in New Jersey, I mean, he would talk about going to these parish council meetings and the pastor being absolutely like just paralyzed by the prospect of proceeding, managed to was not able to move forward and had unilateral decision making. So I don't know, I don't exactly have an answer for this, but I'm just kind of curious of some thoughts here in the room of how we repair or reimagine to have our parish life and structures better work and serve the faithful.
Straight up empower the laity. I feel like St. Teresa is unusual for Catholic churches in that we have a rather strong laity at St. Teresa, that everything is run by lay people, except Mass, right? But more or less, like, people have an idea and they run with it. And my presence is to more connect them. And so because of that, more or less things like I already had nothing to do with the food pantry, right? Like, they already had their own structure. So like my paralysis, because I was paralyzed for those first few month or so after in March, April, and my pastor's paralysis didn't affect the way forward of our parish, right? So I'm of the mindset that a empowered, this is funny because earlier in my class earlier with Darius, I was arguing against an empowered laity. So I guess I don't have any strong moral convictions with this stuff. So, but on the parish level, I feel like if you have different parts of your parish running independently of the staff, if the staff gets messed up, nothing's broken, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think one of the complexities too is that you need good leadership at the top, though, to allow for that kind of empowerment and that lifting up of leaders to happen. And I use the example of our host for this evening's CTU. It presents a really, I think, important vision of what church and co-responsibility can look like, especially in the classroom where you have lay and seminarians and religious all in classrooms together, learning, dialoguing, sharing with one another. But as I often point out, the people missing in those conversations tend to be the diocesan priest. And at the end of the day, for any lay person who's in a formation program at CTU or taking classes or doing a degree program, 90% of them stay in the Chicago area and go work at a local parish and have a very different experience in their formation than their bosses. And I would argue have a very different ecclesiology than their bosses. And so that disconnect, I think, really does create tension at the parish level that creeps up in all sorts of very challenging and sometimes very unhealthy ways. But to answer your question, Gabrielle, I think at the heart of it, it's how do we create a shared formation among all those people who end up having, some sort of skin in the game of what happens in parish life, so that they're coming in with a more unified idea of what that can look like. Having I shared this in class this morning as well, having had dinner with a good friend who's a priest and works at the seminary. I know that it's really hard right now in that space as well, because you're experiencing a very different reality of what you're called to be as a priest right now. This current reality, I think, has really scared a lot of priests because they're often formed to be those sacramental agents, and so much of your identity is tied into it. And I felt like Natalia said it really well, there's almost a crisis of faith when everything that you've been told is your job, you can no longer do because of this pandemic. And I think that's been part of why it was so hard in some cases for priests to accept the health and safety risk and the measures that were being asked by their diocese and the bishop, because so much of their identity was tied up in their ability to say the mass, and offer the mass for their community. So that disconnect, I think, is just the challenge. Do I think we can fix it? Yes, but it's going to take a lot of intentional work, starting at the seminary to say, how do we have all the people who are going to end up working in these parishes actually have formation together so they're on the same page?
Oh man, if we're going to talk about seminary formation, oof, I'm going to have to go for a walk.
That might not be the best issue for tonight. Peter, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I did. Mark, can you clarify what you said at the very end of your comments about staff and lay empowered ministries? You said something that confused me. I made a face.
You did make a face. I guess what I'm saying, the main point of what I'm saying is that so a lot of the problems that came up with the COVID issue was that parishes didn't know what to do. And what I've learned is that a lot of parishes are very centered on their staff, about what the staff is doing, that stuff happens in the parish on behest of the staff, that if something's going to be changed, it's the parish, it's the staff that has to do it. In my opinion, that if we empower the laity, right? If I'm going to use the example at St. Teresa, that the food pantry has its own head in the parish, and it runs with little or no input from what the staff. And what I'm saying is, if that's like what it looks like at other parishes, if something happens with the staff, or if people are paralyzed because of COVID, which happened, what Darius is saying, in a lot of communities, that laity will be able to run those events without the need of the pastor or anything like that. Of course, there's tons of issues in any statement you say, right? That you can make the argument then, what if the laity becomes frozen with it, right? That I guess you could say that St. Teresa was lucky of having specifically really good food pantry managers, but let's say there's a parish that doesn't have as good of people with it, then that's a tough time. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And I think it's a good segue to launching into part 4 of this afternoon's conversation.
All right.
What should stay or what should go?
Yeah, so we'll share just a little bit more from the panel. This won't be as long as that first section, but what the last question that set up was just where are we going next? What's the trajectory for parish life, and what should stay, and maybe where do we need to look in a different direction? So Gabriella, I'll let you go ahead and share your screen again, and feel free to put your thoughts in the chat as well.
It is quite common, right? We're always talking about the future of the church, And these past 7 months, it would seem at times that it's completely changed the trajectory. But I'm wondering, do you think that it has changed the trajectory? Were we always headed in this direction? And what's here to stay? What should stay?
I think it's intensive. It's accelerated some of the changes that we're starting. So it accelerated polarization. If you were barely hanging on, just going to mass out of obligation, it probably cut you loose. If you were dragging your teenager to mass, the teenager got cut loose. So it accelerated processes that were probably already underway. But in terms of what is here to stay, one thing that I hope is here to stay is what Brett was saying about the rediscovery of lamentation, right? The rediscovery of the Psalms, really, in all of their emotional spectrum, right? The imprecatory psalms, the lamentation psalms, the calls for justice, the anti-cultist prophetic passages that decry sort of bad liturgy or self-righteousness. I hope that we can rediscover that and allow that to be at home in our faith and hold that kind of dialectic, that we can be a people of hope without rushing through lamentation, that we can have a moment to pause and look at the lives that were lost, the normal that was lost, and to mourn with God that reality. That's what I hope we keep.
I really do love that part about the lamentation. I'm a super fan of Nuestra Señora de Dolores as well, but the song Santa Maria del Camino is so strong with "we accompany Mary, we accompany God." The notion that we see God in everyone else and we need to accompany everyone else in that sense, our Imago Dei. I think that needs to continue to remain strong front and center, and attending to who is suffering. Some people are like, I'm so overwhelmed because all I see are things from Black Lives Matter and who is being killed by police and the hyper-militarization and people who are seeking asylum and being kept in the detention centers or not being allowed in to the country. And these are all people's lives. And I do hope we continue to keep attending to all of those pieces and paying attention more closely to other people's lives, even though I think it is easier to maybe just turn on Netflix and shut it all out many days. But it's kind of so everywhere that it's hard to ignore anymore. And I hope that actually stays, because I hope we transform that, not that the suffering stays.
I think one of the things that I would like to see, and I hope I'll see continue, is our churches being spaces that offer space for prophetic dialogue. And so what do I mean by that? To talk about the things that are really relevant and really important issues, but to create space where we can encounter one another and encounter these experiences. I've had so many fruitful and genuine conversations in this time when we couldn't gather. I think partly because people felt comfortable, more comfortable at home than they would in front of a group of people. But also it's opened up spaces that just weren't there before, that we just hadn't thought of or used before. And so prophetic dialogue, I think, really invites us to listen to the other, to others, and especially within the church right now. I think that need is there. But then to really say, how do we incorporate what we're hearing into our pastoral response, into our lived discipleship in the world? And I call attention to Cardinal Bernardine and his Call to Be Catholic speech 25 years ago. If you haven't read it, I recommend it, because it sounds like it could have been written yesterday. And yet, when you talk about the polarization, when you talk about the tough issues that we need to talk about, everything is reflected in there. And I think this is a moment for our parishes to be spaces that allow for those important conversations to take place, because it's happening, and it's not necessarily happening in our four walls, in our parish spaces right now. But I think our communities have opened up room to have those important conversations.
On the issue of polarization, I heard something recently that I found kind of surreal, but maybe speaks to this. But where there's a cathedral in the Midwest where they had a number of people that would not wear masks at Mass. So they put them all in the same section in the back. I don't know what to make of that or how to talk about it, but I do see that at least there's some attempt to find a way to bridge. The trajectory I'm more interested in is this kind of a focus that we've had for a long time, worrying about people disaffiliating, especially young people, and the lessening of Mass attendance, almost to the point sometimes of it becoming kind of a moral panic that the world is going to crumble around us. And I hope what this does is changes the trajectory of our attention to that a little bit, that the solutions can't all be in the parish, they can't all be around parish renewal programs. There has to be more attention to the way that people pray and live at home, the way that people, catechize within their families, and all those things, many of which are already happening in beautiful places all around, and some of them have come from Latin America in a very powerful way. But I hope that the trajectory changes a little bit and that we're more attentive to them.
I want to thank you all so much for sharing the.
All right. So Mark will not be surprised on this because he's in my class, but
I rolled my eyes. I know where
I know.
you're going.
I had to get the Bernadine shout out in there. Steve would have killed me if I didn't. But no, I want to put it in the context of particularly this community here. I thought some of the conversations we had over the spring and the summer were some of the most life-giving conversations I've had in the context of faith and church and community. But it was because we were willing to address the really big, messy issues that we were seeing and experiencing in our life, and allowing space for dialogue and conversation and differences in thoughts and opinion. And that, for me, I think is a hallmark of what good community looks like, because that's what family looks like. In one of the other comments I was made, it's like family is that space that we keep getting together, even though it can be messy, especially during the holidays. And our identity as community is what draws us together, and keeps us coming back, even if we don't necessarily like everybody's thoughts or beliefs or opinions on these issues. And for me, I think that's when church is at its best. But I think, particularly thinking about the future of parish, if we are not willing to engage in those big, difficult issues, Brett, I thought, brought it up really well. We're lamenting the disaffiliation of young people. I keep saying I don't think we should be surprised that they're leaving when we're not talking about the things that are relevant in their lives. And it's not even us sometimes giving beliefs that are different than what they believe. It's just we don't even talk about the issues. And I think that probably is what makes us as church seem more irrelevant than anything that somebody tweets or says, or posts on Facebook. It's the not wanting to talk about those things. So those were just some of the insights that really struck me. But what struck you there, and what do you think is going to either need to stay for parish life to continue, or what do you think needs to go?
Talking about young people, I keep, okay, maybe this isn't the right audience for this reference, but have you all seen Mean Girls? Yes, thank you, Gabrielle. So there's a scene where they're at a store and Regina George is trying on clothing, and it's like, whatever the name of the store is, they only have 3 sizes of clothing, and so if you don't fit into any of those items, those sizes, you can't shop there. That's how I feel about the church right now. It's like, well, you left, you literally don't do anything for me, you're not really giving me much of a choice. Is it that young people are leaving, or that we're forcing them away? And I think there's a lack of accountability on leadership's part, because that would involve change, and we know how people feel about change. But then there's also sort of a lack of accountability with a lot of I don't even want to say elders necessarily, but people who've been in parish communities for a long time, who are also just drawn to the way things are, right? And that's okay, because that's what church means to them. That's what they're comfortable with. But I think, when we talk about, in Chicago at least, the history of how all these parishes popped up, it's rooted in us not wanting to be one community, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really not, it shouldn't at least be a surprise to anybody that we're not very good at broadly forming community. And it's, again, no surprise that there are all these inequities around neighborhoods around the city. All of that ties into each other. So it's just like an abject, what's the word? Not even negligence, but like you've just given up this responsibility that in a lot of ways the church, at least the Catholic Church, is the only one with the scope to do it. And that's actually what's sad, is there's so much potential in terms of that reach. But having spent just a year at the Arch, that was enough for me. That was plenty for me. I didn't need more. But working on the fundraising side, it's really discouraging, actually, because so when you talk about what needs to stay and what needs to go, everybody in power needs to go. Everybody in power needs to go. Everybody that's a priest, everybody that's running any department in the Archdiocese needs to go. That's my perspective right now, because I've been part of conversations where people are like, the problem with Catholic education is we just have too many poor schools. And so they're taking away resources from the middle income schools, and that's not fair, right? Those are the conversations happening at leadership levels. Or when a principal from a majority Black school on the South Side calls and says, hey, I can't use these marketing materials. There are no Black kids on them. And can you just create some marketing materials with kids that look like my kids? And the response she gets is, well, they're not white kids, they're Latino, right? That's not encouraging. So for the third largest city in the country, everybody needs to go. And this isn't even a political statement with Cardinal, because I really like Cardinal. I think he's a really smart dude. But in terms of what needs to go, the whole culture just needs to be flipped in Chicago, at least, because it just ignores the majority of the people who are in parishes or really trying to engage in community in meaningful ways in favor of people who are writing checks. And maybe that's just my lens because I work in fundraising, but it's not an encouraging one. So that's my take.
Oh my God, that's straight up. Yeah, wow. This is why I like Commonweal.
You're free to say it here, even when we're recording.
Yeah. I don't really know how I can follow up, burn it down like that. Like,
to be fair, I know a priest. I won't say which priest, but I know a priest who, when we would talk about renew my church and consolidations, he's like, we shouldn't go through this at all. We should just close the parishes we know need to close. Why are we dragging out the inevitable for everybody? Just close the parishes that need to close. Let's just be done. Like,
is the priest Cardinal Dolan? Is the priest you're talking to Cardinal Dolan? Like,
but anyway, I not that I agreed with him, but
yeah,
there's a big scope in how people respond.
Yeah.
I naturally was gonna say I want to echo that, but what I'm about to say has nothing about what you're about to say.
Should I turn off the recording?
Oh no, it just we should all just become Episcopalian, just like then like share that with like a labelless VHS tape to the cardinal, and like look what your pastoral ministers are saying. Sorry, where was I? Sorry, Catholic humor is only small segments of the population. So, but I just want to echo about what to keep, because it's been my baby the last like 6 months, is doing digital ministry. I even after this, the Zoom ministry, I do not think is going to go away. And some of the best conversations that I've had actually with our alpha group is actually, I've been told by some of our hosts are saying it's some of the best conversations they've had, period. Like in any small group in like their entire pastoral career. And the ability to reach people. We had someone from Canada join the racial justice group, like the ability to connect people across geographic barriers is very helpful and something we have to keep. Of course, there's problems with this, that not everyone has access to high-speed internet. there's definitely, and it's definitely going to skew white, just very, very plainly. But like, you can't solve all the problems in the first 6 months, but I've seen a promising future for the Catholic Church on the digital airwaves outside of the high and Bishop Barron manner of digital ministry, which would be helpful.
Yeah, in some ways, I feel like it's been a bit of a democratization of the virtual airwaves of Catholic U.S. culture, because I think for a while it was a very kind of key group of people who were influencers in creating content, and now there's so much that's out there. And Naomi said it really well in another part of the panel, that it's just actually been so exciting to see kind of big name pastoral ministers, theologians, people who have really relevant things to share, saying yes to online webinars and joining conversations. I mean, I think of our last session with Bishop Cherie, that would have never been something that could have happened, in person, last year. And yet we got to hear, directly from him, on his own both experiences and feelings about racial justice in light of the church. So this has opened up a door, and it came up also in the panel. I really don't want us to get too caught up in this idea of getting back to normal, because we have to recognize normal wasn't great for a lot of people. There were a lot of people who were left out of what was normal then. And I think this is an opportunity for us to think bigger and better, and let's go into a new reality, new space, learning from the lessons that we've learned these last few months and doing better than where we came from. Because going back, I don't think is healthy for anyone. To Mariam's point, change is hard. Nobody wants to change, but we've been given an opportunity to change and evaluate for the better. And so I think that's one invitation every parish needs to wrestle with is, how can we be better coming out of this moment than we were 7 months ago?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm looking forward to as well, just because off of what another thing that Naomi had said earlier was like that the places that are just like outpouring with meeting needs has been like the Catholic social services, like everything that's outside of the parish is really that there are a lot of demands and a real need for those. And I feel like if the pandemic has been very revelatory of showing institutions as real, like true colors. I feel like when I've been observing how like different Catholic publications or Catholic social services or even individual parish presences, when I see how they interact now with that time, I feel like we're already starting to see a picture of like the people who are recognized that there was kind of something sick in the way that we were operating before, and that we need to transform the way we are now to get to a better place. I feel like I feel more hopeful that those institutions will get there, just because it's not sustainable to try to operate on the old system.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I'm reminded my mom is the person in my life who least adapts to change, hates change, right? Like we'll take the same road no matter the construction, like doesn't matter what's happening, she'll sit there and take that street. And one of the things I've gotten into the habit of saying to her is sometimes the universe circumstances are created that make you change, right? It's not about you wanting to or not. And I think COVID is one of those circumstances. And so the thing I say to her is like, God's working even through the devil, right? And I think that that's kind of where we are, is this is the time to blow things up because everything's already turned upside down. And, the things that are prominent problems now are only prominent problems because they're affecting people we know and we love. But like I said at the beginning, right, there were hungry people a year ago and there were sick people a year ago. And what were we doing for them? And it's not to say that churches aren't or people aren't, but we certainly weren't talking about it in any sort of real way. It wasn't the meaningful thing that was driving us. So I think in some ways, what's the old adage? Adversity reveals character or something like that. And I think that's where we are. So I'm going to try to stay hopeful today and hope that this keeps us, looking at our better angels. But it certainly activated me in ways I didn't think about before. Like you all have said, I miss our Monday weekly calls. It's kind of the most reflective time I get. And in the midst of 3,000 Zoom calls a week, it's nice to have one where you can settle and kind of reflect thoughtfully. So I think there's a lot of hope in terms of what church is supposed to do. I think we just may not need buildings to do any of it.
Just one last thought, and then I'll open it up for any final comments that want to be shared. I think my perspective going into the panel today was really just a note of affirmation for community like this, and recognizing, this isn't necessarily tied to a parish, but I think especially when we look at where the future of community life is for the church ahead, I think if we are going to be a church that really meets young people where they're at, we're going to have to get used to these kinds of spaces and allowing for these kind of conversations to happen. And I think that was really a gift for me in the midst of all of this pandemic. And there were definitely weeks that, as much as I missed going to my church, a few blocks away, I felt like I definitely had experiences of church and sacramental experiences from the community that was here. So both a word of thanks and a word of affirmation for, those who are at the front lines and trying to create that space. And Peter, you asked that question, is it the parish that needs to do it, or is it the people? And I would argue, like, who's the parish? If it only is the pastor and the staff who have that responsibility, then I think we've definitely missed the more inclusive definition of church, which is all of us. And I think I want to challenge us to say, you are your parish. You are not just a member, but you are also that embodiment of the parish out in the world. And so if we really believe that parish life is something that needs to continue into this new moment in the world, we better go out and do it because it really is going to be up, I think, to younger people to help bring the church where it needs to be in the future, and help to bring parishes where they need to be in the future. And it definitely cannot be confined by those four walls. If we really believe the church is the people, then that is a symbol of our faith in our community. It is not the end all be all. And I think more so than ever before, these last 7 months have taught me that. Any last comments or thoughts as we wrap up? Oh, would you like to share?
I do. This is the young person. This is 7 months in waiting. This is my son, my youngest, being confirmed in the new normal.
Mm-hmm.
And I would... It's been interesting to witness what all of us have gone through and how we've had to adapt and have had to change. And when I think about Sean, he just rolled with it, just like Bishop Cherie said, let it roll. He says, he wasn't really broke up about the postponement of the confirmation and the sacrament. He kind of missed out on being with his, I'll call them faith buddies from his, formation classes and such. But when a call came to step up and be a peer minister, he didn't hesitate. When, so it and he hasn't stopped. He continues to do these things without any particularly, intentional or deliberate nudge from me. Um, and when I finally read the email from the parish, he goes, "Oh yeah, I took care of that." So, if I had anything that I learned today, uh, is that there is that hope, and you know, as long as I can continue to bring this group together, we're going to continue fanning that flame of hope. I want to thank you, Darius. It was wonderful to be with you tonight.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, I'd say your panel, I just have to say, like, I think it really did restore a sense of hope for a lot of people.
Well, I just want to say my thanks again, both for this community and for the creativity and conversation and where we're allowing ourselves to go. I think our imagination can be broad and wide when we think about the future of the church, but we have to let our spaces be ones that allow us to do that. So Mariam, I am going to kick it to you for any final announcements, if we have any.
Well, we do have coming up. I know there's like this small election that you all may have heard of.
Is it county commissioner? A small dog
Actually,
catcher?
alderman. Yeah.
Alderman.
Yeah, so on November 3rd, big day, election day, I actually have to do my early vote this week. So if you haven't voted, please do. We are going to be hosting a conversation with Matt Sitman from Commonweal. Does he go by Matt? I feel like I've heard him.
He goes by Matt.
Okay, I didn't want to be overly familiar, given that I don't know him. He's an editor at Commonweal, and we've got a great lineup of panelists, which of course I just closed that window. Good job, me. But it's in the email where the wonderful email Peter puts together, and I'm sure we'll send out a couple of more promos between now and then. So we hope you'll join us. We're having a little watch party. I'm pretty excited to geek out with some of my favorite people. Bring your own drinks. I am going to mute myself when I'm being vulgar, or at least try to. Peter, anything else I'm missing on the November?
The panel includes Miguel Diaz,
yes,
former ambassador to the Vatican, Heidi Schlumpf from wonderful.
Thank you. There we go. Matt Sitman, Miguel Diaz, Heidi Schlumpf from National Catholic Reporter, and John Kenneth White, who teaches at Catholic University of America.
I just sent an email to Heidi yesterday. So
she was actually at one of our very first Weal meetings when Zach Zaya set these up a couple of years ago. She's lovely, so I'm excited to hear from her again. So yeah, it's a couple of hours with your favorite people. Just watch election results come in. I really doubt we're gonna have. I don't know. Actually, I don't know what's going to happen, but I kind of doubt that we're gonna have a clear answer that day. But it should still be fun. So I hope you'll join us, Mark.
Just you.
Bring your friends.
And anybody watching this recording.
Yeah, that too. Man, I really hope. Never mind. This joke's not going to make sense. It was only going to make. I had a joke when I was. I was in college during 2016, and I had a joke where because everyone was so bummed after the election, and so I was like, man, I'd like walk into a room and I'd be like, man, can you guys believe the election? And they're like, yeah, man, can't believe that Gore lost Florida. And I lost a lot of friends over the course of like 3 weeks. And then I found God, and then he's my friend.
There you go. That was a really emotional week for me. I'm a Cubs fan, so I went from like the biggest like high, and everybody on the train was like the happiest I've ever seen them, and then the next week it was just like all the air had been sucked out. It was fun, but it should be interesting either way. you know, we may just be talking about the state of democracy next time. So we'll see how that goes.
It's very unlikely we'll have any answers by the end of the night, but who knows? We might have even more fun questions. So come and join.
That's what the drinks are for.
Well, I have to head out, but
Thanks, Mark.
All right. Thanks, everyone.